this video, our team will present 5 ideas which, in our opinion, were crucial for understanding the book Transforming a Broken Refugee System. The first key point here are the concepts of heartless head and headless heart. The European Union countries first faced this choice after the crisis in Syria began. The Syrian refugees mostly fled to Turkey, where in the beginning there was not much of a help provided for them, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, didn't really help either, and just went with the flow using the principle of a heartless head. Moreover, the subsequent costs arising from the substantiation proved that it was also headless. To illustrate this, the authors use a metaphor of a child, who in our case is Syria, who is drowning in a pond and crying for help. You, representing the European Union countries, are standing by the pond, and so the authors pose a question. Is it legitimate for you to ignore the child, or is it your moral obligation to save the child? Compassion and headless heart are in the core of human condition. The boundaries of our moral community go beyond those of our political community, including towards refugees. The metaphor will be elaborated later on in the video, but for now I'll just say that if there is another person standing by the pond, there are 2 possibilities. The first one is each individual waits for someone else to jump in, and so the child drowns. Unfortunately, this is what happened in Syria. However, there is another option, which is the solution for the states and their refugee policy. The child can be saved by combining the head and the heart and using the principle of comparative advantage, which we will be talking about in a moment.
So I'm going to talk about another key idea of the book, the use of comparative advantage. So in this point in the book, the authors and the readers, us, have come to an agreement that this refugee crisis is a crisis, and it is a global crisis that needs to be handled immediately and correctly. And so the authors, they use the example of a drowning child to lead into the idea of comparative advantage. The example of the drowning child is that in a park, a child is drowning in a lake, and there's an old man getting ready to save him, but the old man may drown in the process or may come to great harm. And on the other hand, there's you, a fit young person who knows how to swim, who after saving the child, the worst thing that could come to you is just getting wet. And the old man also has a towel for you. And so through this example, since as readers and as just people with conscience, we would assume that it is the young fit person's duty to save the child, the authors introduced the idea of comparative advantage, saying that the European Union is like the young person who knows how to swim, that because it has excess resources, that it should save the refugees, handle them properly. However, I find this comparison and argument unpersuasive because, first of all, for the European Union, it is not a simple matter of completing a heroic act and just going home and changing and going back to their everyday life like nothing ever happened. They have been affected ever since, and they're still suffering the financial losses even up to this day, and there's division in their society because people can't agree on how to handle the refugee crisis. And then another problem I have with this argument is that just because a country or a union has excess resources, that they have practiced capitalism, that their country is stable, it does not automatically turn into a moral obligation for them to become a charity on a global scale. And in the end, the authors, they do kind of touch on this point that because the idea of comparative advantage has been applied and that Europe has been helping the refugees because of its position and economic status, that Europe had turned the refugees, real refugees, into political economic migrants, that their lives have not only been saved, but they actually have a better standard of living. They make more money by just being a refugee in Europe than how they had lived even before the Soviet unrests in their home country.
Moving on to the next point, refugees should be given economic freedom. As it is stated in the book, Syrian refugees are faced with three options when fleeing the country, and those are A, go to a refugee camp, B, go to an urban area, and C, go on a journey with smuggling networks. In points A and B, options do not imply the right to work, and option C also means to give up the right of movement. So how does one work out a solution? Why do the host countries need to create job opportunities to the people who might not even be qualified? Well, there is an example of Uganda, who hosts more refugees in 1 year than the EU in the past years altogether. In Uganda, the government decided to give work opportunities and freedom of movement to the refugees, and as a result this model has benefited to the country, so much so that 29% of refugees have their own business in Uganda, and that employs at least one other person, and also 40% of the employees of this business are the nationals of the country, of the host country. So this system has created jobs within the country only by the initiative of the refugees. Also, we can take a look at Greece in the interwar period in 1920s, when Greece provided plots of land and job opportunities to the refugees, which has then economically benefited the country. And one last example could be the Guatemalan refugees after the end of the Cold War, who found themselves a place in Mexico, and on the support of European community money, this has benefited the Yucatan's infrastructure. So, drawing on the conclusion from the mentioned facts, we can see that if a refugee is treated like a person and is given a job opportunity and an opportunity to take care of oneself and be reliant on oneself, this only benefits the country and creates an infrastructure within the country only by the initiative of the refugees. So this is why the refugees and the asylum seekers should be given an economic freedom.
The first idea which is deserved to be mentioned is the idea of two related terms. The first one is the charter cities, and the second one is the incubator cities. These are cities with both good physical infrastructure and conducive regulations, where refugees would live peacefully and as in a viable haven. These incubator cities have three main purposes. Firstly, they would be advantages to the host country. Secondly, they obviously will serve the needs of refugees. And finally, they prepare the recovery of post-conflict economy of the country of the origin. The idea behind the first purpose is that although it is very costly to invest in such cities, although in the long term it would turn way more profitable for the host country if refugees could live freely and work in such incubators. The second example is that nowadays for many refugee children there is no ability to have a bright future just because there are no schools for refugees, and moreover, parents do not want their children to learn the foreign language and culture. For this purpose, exactly, those incubator cities are needed, where refugees would live in their culture and with other refugees as in a little commune. Lastly, it is helpful for the economy of the origin state because when refugees are going back in their home country, different skills and professions will be needed to sustain the economy of the country. Unfortunately, those skills can be acquired only in universities, and there is little ability for a refugee to go there. So in incubator cities, it will be more possible. Furthermore, refugees have an obligation to return to their home country which they might not want to do, and in incubator cities it will obviously it is obviously because they cannot stay there forever.
A book written by Betts and Collier, Transforming a Broken Refugee System, one of the major topics discussed is the need of new institutions. The situation with refugees in the modern world is rather controversial. Modern refugee system is not developed enough due to the fact that refugees are people who are seeking better life because of fear of persecution, because of different factors such as race, religion, or political opinion. They are in need of eventual road out of limbo. In order to provide them with it, I believe that a lot of new institutions are needed to be created. First of all, they are safety havens. It is very important to create havens that will give an opportunity for refugees to get some more knowledge in order to find better work and earn money for living. As refugees are those who decided to move from a country where a war or a crisis occurred, there is a possibility that they lack of education. Thus, in order to survive in a developed country, they have to get more valuable experience in different fields. However, some countries abuse people and economically exploit them. In order to prevent people from this, it is essential to ensure their option to work is voluntary and that employment practices meet basic standards. Finally, the creation of new institutions will not prevent people from moving, but they will just rescue them. I believe that it is an inevitable issue that will happen always, despite the fact that the world is changing in a better way.